Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So about 3 hours ago, Matthew Penning at Penning Labs deployed a new version of LXConsole, and it is version 0.6.1. And although this version seems to be rather minor, there's a couple of things in it that I wanted to go ahead and point out. To begin with, he has a release notes section here where he talks about the additions that you'll now find in 0.6.1, but I'm going to look at a couple of things that I think are important. I've released a couple of videos in the past about LXConsole, and notably one entitled LXConsole Web Interface for Incus. And here I have LXConsole version 0.6.0 running, and if I do an about, it says that LXConsole is an open source management console providing a web-based user interface capable of managing multiple LXD and Incus servers from a single location. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at how to upgrade to the newest version of LXConsole. We're going to head on down to the terminal prompt, and here I have SSH'd into my Incus container named LXConsole, where I have my installation of LXConsole. And if I cd into a folder called LXConsole and I do an ls, I basically have a folder for certs and a folder for the server. And if we just take a look at the Docker Compose real quickly, just as a review, the Docker Compose is really straightforward. I basically have I'm pointing to a folder for the backups, a folder for the certificates, and a folder for the server instance configuration information as well. And I'm mapping Matthew's port of 5000 inside the container back to port 80. And the reason I can do that is because port 80 is available since it's on a dedicated Incus container, which has an address on my main LAN. So in order to upgrade most Docker applications, you would simply do a Docker Compose pull, and Docker Compose pull will look out and see if there is a new version of the container. And as you can see here, it is pulling a new version of LXConsole, namely version 0.6.1. Although it is possible to do a Docker Compose up-D at this point in time to load the newer container that has just been pulled, a better way to do this is to do a Docker PS and to see that we have this container ID here. So I'm going to do a Docker stop on the container ID. I'll do a Shift-Control-C and Shift-Control-V, and it will go ahead and stop that particular container. And once the container is stopped, which stops the application, since in this case there is only the single container, then I will do a Docker delete on that same container ID. And I guess delete isn't the command I need to use. I'll just go ahead and say rm, which will go ahead and remove that container. Now if I do a Docker Compose up-D, it will go ahead and start the newer version of 0.6.1. So the reason for the stop and the delete is if we hadn't done that and just did a Docker Compose up-D, we would have both the 0.6.0 container and the 0.6.1 container. So to keep your Docker application servers well maintained, it's a good idea to delete the older containers that you're no longer using. Here we are back up at my web interface, and in order to connect to it again, we're going to have to log in since we stopped and restarted the application. So I'm using my Bitwarden here to recall my credentials, and I'm clicking on Login. One of the first things that is new is if we go over here to Account, you'll see that we have multi-factor authentication, which we had added in the last version, but this time when we say turn multi-factor authentication on, we're actually seeing the key down here. So if you're using something like Bitwarden to enable your multi-factor authentication for your time-based one-time passwords, you can copy this key and put that in there, and you will have your multi-factor authentication enabled. And so that just gives you an alternative separate from actually scanning the QR code that you see here. Let's head on over to our server list. And in this case, I'm going to go over to the server VMS Rain, which is where I have most of my larger containers running. And I'll go ahead and click on containers. And so as an example, if I go down to something like my Rocket Chat container, here we see Rocket Chat listed here, and it is possible to do a backup. Of course, I've got a couple of backups due to my recent updates to my Rocket Chat. And for those of you who have not yet joined the chat, I encourage you to go out to chat.scotti-BYTE.com, register for an account, and start communicating with the other folks in the group. And I'm out there frequently, so if you have any questions about any of the other videos that I've created, certainly that is the place to ask about them. So backups in LXConsole are equivalent to the Incus export command or the LXD export command in the case of LXD containers. So here I'm going to click on the backup and say, create me a backup. In the background, this is actually doing the Incus export command, as I mentioned. And you can give your backup a name if you want. And then down here, we have a choice of compression. For those of you who have done a backup on a larger container, you know that it takes a really long time to perform a backup with the default gzip compression. One of the updates that we're seeing in this particular version of LXConsole version 0.6.1 is the addition of the LZ4 compression. In order to have support for that, you're going to have to head over to your Incus server. And in my case, if I SSH over to VMS Rain, in order to take advantage of that LZ4 compression, you would to have had to have done an sudo apt install on LZ4 to have LZ4 compression installed. And here you can see that I already have it installed and it is at its latest version. So I'm going to exit the console here and exit the terminal. So in this case, I'll go ahead and say submit, and I'm leaving the name blank. If I leave the name blank, it will go ahead and name the backup, the name of the container, and then it'll put a date and timestamp. Otherwise, if you put something in the name field, it will be exactly what you enter into the name field. And so I'm going to go ahead and say I want to do this backup or this export with LZ4 compression. And it starts up and says backing up instance Rocket Chat in red at the top. And then down here it says pending. It's gathering some information, and then it starts to initiate the backup. And so it says that it is currently saving 1.98 gigabytes. It's already gotten. And if you've ever done the gzip compression, you will know that it takes a long time to do a backup using it, whereas with the LZ4 compression, a backup is considerably faster. And in fact, one of the things you can see down here is the megabyte per second transfer rate, which when we did our gzip compressions, we usually got anywhere between 4 to 6 megabytes per second. But with this one, we're getting 60 megabytes per second. And it has a lot to do with the efficiency of LZ4 compression. So here we are, and we've done 3 gigabytes of backup. The last one was 2838, so it should be ending here pretty soon. And I can tell you that normally to do this backup, it will take right around 5 minutes, but this time it should take only a few seconds more. Once the backup has been completed, it will simply say completed here, and it is being stored inside of the Incus container itself. To make that backup file external to the Incus container, you're going to click on the Export Backup option, and it goes ahead and prompts you, do you really want to export this tar.lz4 compressed file to a local file? And I'm going to go ahead and say OK, and it will go ahead and export it. Now, if you're using the command line command where you do an Incus export, it actually performs the backup and the export as a single command, whereas in LXConsole, we have 2 steps, the first step being the backup, and the second step being exporting it to a file. And normally after you click the option, it won't start up right away because it's gathering the information necessary to do the export. And once the export begins, we'll notice this status change here, and it said that it has been exported. So the exported file is 3.3 gigabytes, which is actually pretty good, and that is way faster than it was with the gzip compressed file. LXConsole version 0.6.1 is primarily a maintenance release. However, the addition of the LZ4 compression support is a biggie, and it's something I asked Matthew for, and he added it in, which is really fantastic. The other thing is the displaying of the TOTP key alongside the QR code when turning on two-factor authentication. And if you decide to expose your LXConsole to the web, you certainly want to turn on two-factor authentication because you'd want to have your management console very well protected. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit your notification bell, and we'll see you next time.